March 1968. A United States Army captain watched Australian soldiers sawing off their rifle barrels with hacksaws at Nui Dat airstrip. He laughed openly. These men were destroying precision military weapons. The captain turned to his men and said what every American observer was thinking. They would not last a week. 6 hours later, that same captain was screaming into a radio handset, pinned down by enemy fire, watching his company disintegrate. The only people coming to save him were the soldiers he had mocked that morning. What happened next exposed a failure so profound, the Pentagon classified the reports for decades. This is not about courage. It is about why institutions refuse to learn when the cost of ignorance is measured in body bags. The American military believed in a simple equation. Technology plus firepower equals victory. This logic won the Second World War, held Korea, made the United States the most powerful military on Earth. The Australian Special Air Service believed something else entirely. The jungle did not care about technology. It cared whether you understood its rules. The difference was statistical. Australian patrols achieved kill ratios American commanders refused to believe. 1 friendly casualty for every 500 enemy eliminated. American units in adjacent sectors averaged 1 to 12. The disparity suggested one approach worked while another failed catastrophically. The first thing American observers noticed was the smell. Not poor logistics or failed discipline. Deliberate doctrine. Every American soldier carried standard hygiene supplies. Soap, deodorant, shaving cream, insect repellent. The United States Army considered cleanliness essential for morale. The Viet Cong learned to exploit it. Captured enemy fighters confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from over 500 meters away. Chemical signatures from hygiene products were completely alien to jungle environments. Deodorant created scent trails that lingered for hours in humid air. Insect repellent contained compounds detectable at extreme distances. American cigarettes, with their distinctive tobacco, announced positions to scouts within a kilometer. The Australians had eliminated every marker. 2 weeks before any patrol, Special Air Service troopers stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, commercial toothpaste. They switched from American cigarettes to local tobacco or quit smoking completely. They ate indigenous food, including fermented fish sauce that altered their body chemistry. By insertion day, they smelled exactly like the jungle itself, like decomposition, mud, and decay. The results were documented in classified reports American commanders found difficult to process. Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within 2 meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything unusual. In one verified incident from November 1967, an enemy fighter actually stepped on an Australian trooper's boot, looked down, registered nothing but jungle debris, and continued walking. The trooper did not move, did not react, did not breathe visibly. The enemy never knew he had placed his foot on a human being who could have ended his life before his next heartbeat. The weapon called the bitch looked improvised. Barrel shortened by 15 centimeters. Flash suppressor removed. Crude forward grip welded on. American weapons specialists were appalled. The modifications destroyed ballistics, reduced range 60%, created something unprofessional. The standard Australian rifle was the L1A1, variant of the FNFAL, one of the finest battle rifles manufactured, accurate to 400 meters. The Australians were destroying it, or so it appeared. The logic was brutal. Vietnamese jungle visibility averaged 10 to 15 meters. A rifle accurate to 400 meters was useless when you could not see past 15. Full-length barrels snagged on vines, bamboo, undergrowth. Every snag required stopping. Every stop created noise. The bitch slid through vegetation. The shortened barrel eliminated snags. Lost accuracy was irrelevant because there was no long range. The 7.62 millimeter round, even from shortened barrel, delivered stopping power the American 5.56 M16 could not match. The M16's smaller round tended to wound rather than stop. The 7.62 round devastated. American ordnance officers wrote damning reports about modifications. filed alongside recommendations to adopt them, both ignored. The most disturbing adaptation was footwear. Australian troopers wore sandals made from automobile tires with inner tube straps. Ho Chi Minh sandals. Standard Viet Cong footwear. Every American boot left distinctive impressions recognizable to experienced trackers. By wearing enemy sandals, Australians left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement. Trackers assumed friendly forces. No alarm raised. Australians also walked in streams, stepped on roots, brushed out tracks. Methods made them impossible to follow. Viet Cong, who tracked French and Americans at will, could not track Australians. American observers noticed something else. Terminology. Americans used Charlie, Victor, terms ranging from brevity to contempt. Underlying assumption consistent. Enemy inferior, primitive, backwards. Australians called them Mr. Charles. Not sarcasm. Genuine respect. Enemy capabilities studied carefully. This respect had consequences. Americans walked into situations believing technological superiority would prevail. Australians assumed nothing, prepared for everything. Americans sometimes died underestimating capability. Australians survived because they never did. The single most important difference was movement speed. The United States military believed in speed, aggression, and firepower. American special operations moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. This was considered an acceptable balance between caution and urgency. The Australian Special Air Service moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour. When American intelligence officers first heard this figure, they assumed translation error. 100 meters per hour meant covering 1 kilometer required an entire day. 5 kilometers would take nearly a week. This seemed not merely slow, but operationally absurd. The Australians offered demonstration. What American observers witnessed destroyed their understanding of infantry movement. 4 troopers entered jungle terrain 500 meters from Nui Dot perimeter. Point man took 1 step, placing his foot with surgical precision on ground that would support weight without compression or sound. Then the entire patrol froze. Complete stillness. Not reduced movement. 0 movement. 4 minutes frozen. During those 4 minutes, they scanned their surroundings using only their eyes, never turning their heads. They tested air with subtle nostril movements, reading scent the way a predator reads prey. Their fingers made microscopic adjustments on weapons, preparing for instant action while appearing completely inert. They listened with an intensity that seemed almost predatory, processing every sound the jungle produced. After 4 minutes, another step. Another freeze. Another 4 minutes of absolute stillness. In 30 minutes, the patrol covered approximately 50 meters. American observers stood 15 meters away. They heard nothing. Not a rustle. Not a snap. Not a footfall. 4 armed men had moved 50 meters through dense jungle in complete silence. American patrols moving at 2 kilometers per day created disturbances detectable from hundreds of meters away. Snapping branches, rustling leaves, subtle vibrations transmitted through root systems. Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to identify these signatures. A single broken twig could compromise an entire operation. At 100 meters per hour, no signature existed. The jungle soundscape recovered completely between movements. Birds kept singing. Insects kept droning. To enemy listening posts, areas where Australians operated sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. But slow movement provided more than concealment. It transformed Australians from prey into apex predators. Moving at 100 meters per hour, they detected enemy activity long before being detected themselves. Viet Cong patrols moving at normal speeds created exactly the disturbances Australian troopers had trained to recognize. A patrol that had spent 4 hours listening could hear an approaching enemy from extraordinary distances. The hunters became the hunted without ever knowing it. This explained the impossible kill ratios. The Australians were not better marksmen or braver soldiers. They were invisible. They struck from positions no enemy expected and disappeared before effective response was possible. An American intelligence officer spent 3 days documenting observations, drafted detailed recommendations for immediate adoption of Australian methodology. His report was filed, stamped, buried. The Pentagon was not interested, but the jungle would deliver a lesson that could not be filed away. The 173rd Airborne Brigade drew the mission in Long Con Province. 118 paratroopers under a West Point captain on his second tour. Bronze Star holder. Experienced veterans with latest equipment, standard uniforms, standard hygiene. An Australian Special Air Service patrol operated independently nearby. 4 men led by a sergeant with 3 tours. 6 days in jungle already. 17 days without bathing. The forces knew of each other but had not coordinated. The captain saw no reason to. 4 days of patient movement brought Australians within observation distance of a Viet Cong battalion headquarters. 31 hours in single position watching, counting, documenting. Over 200 enemy fighters identified. They reported intelligence through Australian channels. Information was lost, delayed, or dismissed. The American company walked in blind, approaching reinforced enemy position with 10 times their numbers. Viet Cong heard them from over 300 meters. Battalion commander had 30 minutes to prepare. Ambush detonated 11:47. L-shaped killing zone. 23 Americans fell in 20 seconds. Captain implemented prescribed response. Return fire. Call artillery. Request gunships. Artillery impacted within 8 minutes. Gunships arrived 15 minutes. Full American firepower directed at enemy positions. None worked. Viet Cong were in prepared positions constructed over weeks. When barrages came, stayed low in holes designed for near misses. When gunships appeared, used canopy for concealment. Americans could not see their enemy. Shooting at muzzle flashes, expending ammunition against unverified targets. Enemy saw them perfectly. Every few minutes another soldier fell. By 12:30, over 40 casualties. Ammunition running low. The captain recognized his company was being systematically dismantled by an enemy his firepower could not touch. 12:51 hours. The captain made the most humiliating radio call of his career. Requested assistance from the Australian patrol he had declined to coordinate with. The sergeant understood immediately. Allied soldiers being eliminated less than 2 kilometers away. Standard doctrine mandated avoiding decisive engagement. 4 men against reinforced battalion was suicide by conventional analysis. But men were being slaughtered. The sergeant decided in under a minute. They would assist. The Australian way. When the captain learned Australians were moving at 100 meters per hour, his response was volcanic. Men dying in real time. Help 2 kilometers away, sleepwalking through jungle. He demanded faster movement. The sergeant refused. Faster movement meant detection. The next 93 minutes were the longest of the captain's career. The patrol was not moving toward the American position. They were moving into the enemy position. Through it. Using firefight noise as cover, scent discipline to avoid detection, 4 Australians infiltrated directly through Viet Cong rear area. Passed within meters of enemy fighters focused on Americans. Navigated battalion-sized engagement without creating disturbance. Complete silence through vegetation that should make silence impossible. At one point, an enemy fighter moved within arm's reach. Australian froze as the Viet Cong adjusted equipment, checked ammunition, returned to position. Enemy never knew death had been 1 trigger pull away. 14:27 hours. Australian patrol reached position inside Viet Cong perimeter. 35 meters from battalion command post, surrounded by over 200 fighters unaware of their presence. The sergeant began transmitting artillery corrections, precision coordinates with meter accuracy. He saw where enemy command directed battle. Machine gun positions causing heaviest casualties. Ammunition points. Withdrawal paths. First corrected mission landed on command post. Battalion commander and staff ceased to exist in single impact. Command collapsed instantly. Second eliminated machine gun responsible for 40% of casualties. Third sealed primary withdrawal route. Fourth destroyed ammunition point. Secondary explosions continued minutes. Within 18 minutes, battle reversed. Force-destroying American company now eliminated with surgical precision. Surviving Viet Cong fled. American company which faced annihilation could consolidate for extraction. 34 Americans fallen. 51 wounded of 118 engaged. Viet Cong estimated 87 eliminated. Australian patrol suffered 0 casualties. After-action reports classified at highest levels. For institutional protection, 4 Australians accomplished what 118 elite paratroopers with massive fire support could not. Demonstrated beyond denial, American doctrine produced failure, while Australian doctrine produced success. Evidence kept accumulating. Documents captured in late 1968 revealed Viet Cong had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. For Americans, guidance emphasized predictability and vulnerability. Recommended approach was aggressive ambush, inflict maximum casualties, withdraw before artillery. For Australians, guidance was avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush because Australians were more likely to detect the trap. Do not attempt pursuit. If contact unavoidable, break it off and withdraw. The documents used a specific term for Australian soldiers. Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The Viet Cong were afraid in ways they were never afraid of Americans. Enemy activity in Puach Tui province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American sectors. The enemy explicitly instructed forces to avoid Australian contact because Australians were more dangerous. The answer went deeper than tactical technique. The Australian Special Air Service had integrated Aboriginal tracking methodology into operational doctrine. Aboriginal Australians had survived in demanding wilderness environments for over 40,000 years. Their accumulated knowledge of concealment, tracking, patient hunting represented the longest continuous tradition of such skills anywhere on Earth. Aboriginal trackers could determine from a footprint not just direction but weight, load, injury, time passed, alertness. They could read broken vegetation, detect presence through absence. Australian Special Air Service incorporated specific elements, becoming part of the environment rather than moving through it. Reading landscape features, absolute stillness permitting observation without detection, patience sustaining focused attention for hours. American doctrine emphasized action, speed, technology overcoming environment. The idea that patience might outperform aggression was philosophically alien. The tragedy was that lessons were available for learning. Australians shared information freely. Individual Americans recognized value and advocated adoption. Evidence was overwhelming. But institutions do not change because evidence demands change. They change when cost becomes unbearable. For the American military, cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in single catastrophic event. Each ambush was separate incident. Pattern visible only in aggregate statistics, senior commanders had professional reasons not to examine. American patrols continued moving at detectable speeds. American soldiers continued smelling like targets. American doctrine continued emphasizing firepower over patience. Casualties continued accumulating. But Australian methods carried costs measured in different currencies. Operating at 100 meters per hour for weeks required transformation that left permanent marks. Constant hypervigilance could not be maintained without consequences. Some veterans described becoming animal, not metaphorically savage, but literally shedding human thought patterns. Australians learned to eliminate internal noise entirely, exist in pure sensory awareness for days without normal consciousness, perceive without interpreting, observe without planning. This state was tactically invaluable, made them invisible in ways physical concealment could not achieve. But this state could not be switched off when patrol ended. Veterans reported difficulties readjusting to civilian life exceeding standard post-traumatic stress models. Hypervigilance persisting years after service, struggles with relationships. The Viet Cong called them Rung, jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures caught between worlds. Australians who mastered jungle warfare found themselves similarly suspended, not fully present in civilian world, not able to forget jungle world. Some never found their way back. This was price of effectiveness no statistical analysis captured. Australian methods worked. Survival rates proved it beyond dispute. But survival was not same as returning whole. When United States military finally began serious reform of special operations capabilities in the 1980s, reforms incorporated principles Australians had demonstrated decades earlier. Small unit tactics, individual operator judgment, stealth and patience over firepower, cultural adaptation and environmental integration. Modern American special operations community owes significant debt to Australian pioneers. Methods were there. Evidence overwhelming. Australians willing to teach. Institutions not willing to learn. The American captain who made that desperate radio call survived the war. He spent remaining months seeking out Australian personnel, trying to understand why his doctrine failed. Learned his company walked into ambush smelling like a department store. Learned patrol speed announced presence. Learned every assumption was wrong. Also learned men who saved him had been mocked as primitives. Methods dismissed as cowardice. Evidence classified because it embarrassed institutions. He left Army in 1970. Records remained classified decades. But he remembered men who fell because doctrine put them in positions Australian doctrine would have avoided. Radio call begging for help from soldiers he declined to coordinate with. 93 minutes watching command disintegrate. Moment when 4 men who smelled like death emerged from jungle, having walked through enemy battalion without detection. Moment when artillery suddenly began landing with surgical precision. Moment when he understood everything he knew about warfare was wrong. 1 Australian casualty for every 500 enemy eliminated. Not luck, not favorable terrain. That was what happened when soldiers stopped smelling like Americans and started smelling like jungle. When they stopped moving like Americans and started moving like shadows. When they stopped fighting like Americans and started fighting like ghosts. Pentagon knew the numbers. Classified them. Enemy knew the numbers. Feared them. Survivors knew the numbers. Owed their lives to them. 1 to 500. Arithmetic of patience over firepower. Mathematics of adaptation over technology. Calculus of becoming what jungle required rather than demanding jungle accommodate what you preferred to be. 50 years later, lessons remain relevant. Every new conflict produces variations on same theme. Technological overconfidence meeting environmental reality. Institutional assumptions colliding with conditions those assumptions cannot address. Expensive way failing while simple way succeeds. Australians solved the problem in 1966. Americans took decades to learn. Some would argue they still have not fully learned. Rung. Phantoms of jungle. Soldiers dismissed as primitives until they proved themselves masters. Ghosts who saved men who mocked them. That is their legacy. That is what they proved. That is what they left behind for anyone willing to learn. Question is whether those who need lessons most will ever be willing to accept them. This video is for historical and educational purposes only.